December 14th, Elk Ridge, Montana. Minus 19 degrees. And the storm hadn't even started yet. A man stood in the middle of Main Street with everything he owned stuffed into one military-grade pack, a white German shepherd at his side, and a town full of people staring at him like he was already dead. Nobody stepped forward. Nobody said a word in his defense. This was Ethan Cade, a retired Navy SEAL who had served 3 combat deployments, survived ambushes in places most people couldn't find on a map, and come home to a life that collapsed anyway. Not from a bullet. Not from a bomb. From a single icy highway, a single winter night, and a single phone call that ended everything he had ever loved. And here he was, standing in the cold while a man named Wade Mercer pointed toward the mountain road and told him, loudly enough for the whole street to hear, that nobody in this town owed him anything. But here is what nobody in that town knew. The mountain behind them was hiding something. Something buried deep under decades of ice and snow and intentional silence. Something that had been concealed for a very long time by very specific people for very specific reasons, and the only soul on earth who could sense it was Ghost. The white shepherd lifted his nose toward the frozen ridgeline. His ears locked forward. His body went completely still in a way that Ethan had learned to trust with his life. Because Ghost had never been wrong. Not once. Not in combat. Not in the dark. Not in the cold. What was buried up there on that mountain? Why had someone worked so hard to hide it? And when the worst blizzard in 40 years began swallowing Elk Ridge whole, who would end up needing that secret more than anyone could have possibly imagined? Stay with this story. Because before it ends, a man who lost everything is going to find something that changes everything. And a white dog is going to lead him there. The morning Ethan Cade was pushed out of Elk Ridge began like every other morning that December, gray, bitter, and indifferent. The sky pressed down on the Montana Valley like a cold iron weight, and the wind that moved through the gap between the eastern ridge and the pine-covered slope to the west carried a particular kind of sharpness that only people who had lived through real mountain winters would recognize as a warning. It was not the usual wind. It was the kind of wind that arrived ahead of something serious, the kind that moved through a town like a scout, testing the windows and the eaves and the gaps in the doorframes before sending back a report to whatever massive system was building itself just beyond the visible horizon. Old-timers in Elk Ridge knew that wind. They had a name for it. They called it the breathe before the bite. Ethan Cade did not hear those conversations. He had not been inside any of the warm buildings where those conversations happened. He had been sleeping in the back corner of a storage outbuilding behind Wade Mercer's outfitter shop for the past 11 days, not because Wade had offered it out of generosity, but because Ethan had found an unlocked latch one night when the temperature dropped below what his body could sustain outdoors, and he had slipped inside without asking. Ghost had curled against him in the dark, sharing warmth the way working dogs understand before their handlers ever think to ask. For 11 days, Ethan had been invisible. He had moved through Elk Ridge quietly, eating what little he could from the small emergency ration still packed at the bottom of his military bag, not asking for anything, not drawing attention, trying to disappear into the background of a town that had not invited him and did not want him. He had arrived in Elk Ridge 6 weeks earlier by accident, not design. His truck had died on the mountain pass 12 miles east of town, and by the time the tow driver had dropped him in front of the single gas station on Main Street, the first real snow of the season had already closed the road behind them. He had been stuck ever since. There were people in Elk Ridge who had seen him and looked away. There were people who had asked brief questions. Who are you? Where are you from? What happened to you? And then nodded at his quiet answers and moved on without offering anything further. There was a woman at the diner who had twice left a paper bag at the end of the counter with a cup of coffee beside it, and not looked up when he came in, which was the closest thing to kindness he had experienced in months. But there was no room for him here. That much had been made clear without anyone needing to say it directly. Ghost moved through all of it with dignity. That was the only word for it. The white shepherd carried himself through Elk Ridge's cold streets with an ease and calm that Ethan had long since stopped being surprised by, because Ghost had been trained in environments that made a small Montana town look like a vacation resort. He had worked in desert heat and jungle humidity and mountain terrain. He had tracked in zero visibility. He had held his composure in the middle of chaos that would have broken most animals twice his size. He wore his black tactical K9 jacket with the quiet authority of a professional who understood the weather and was dressed for it, and the people of Elk Ridge who noticed him at all mostly noticed the dog first and the man second, which was, in its own quiet way, appropriate. The morning everything broke open started just before 9 o'clock. Wade Mercer came out through the back door of his outfitter's shop and found the storage building unlocked and Ethan folding his thermal layer inside his pack with the focused efficiency of someone who knew how to pack fast and move faster. Ghost was already on his feet, jacket on, watching the door. Wade stood in the cold for a moment and looked at the two of them, and then his expression shifted from surprise into something harder and more public, like a man who had made a decision and was looking forward to executing it. He did not speak immediately. He went back inside. And then he came back out the front door of the main shop, onto the sidewalk facing Main Street, and he said it loudly. He said it with the volume and the tone of a man who wanted an audience, and in a small town at 9 in the morning with the wind picking up and people already moving between the hardware store and the coffee shop and the post office, an audience was easy to find. "That's the man who's been squatting in my storage shed," Wade said to no one specific and everyone in general. 11 days. Didn't ask. Didn't say a word. Just moved himself in like it was his to use. Ethan came around the side of the building with his pack and Ghost beside him, and he walked into the small open space between the shop front and the street without hurrying and without flinching, and he stood there while the words landed on him. Ghost pressed lightly against his left leg, not from fear but from the kind of proximity that working dogs maintain when they sense their partner is under pressure. A few people had stopped. A man near the hardware store doorway had turned to look. 2 women with grocery bags had paused on the sidewalk. A teenager on a bicycle had put one foot down and was watching with the bored curiosity of someone who expected something interesting to happen. "He's been sleeping in my property," Wade continued, and there was something almost theatrical about the way he said it, something that suggested he had considered his words and found them satisfying. "No rent. No permission. Didn't ask anyone for anything because asking would have meant being told no." He looked directly at Ethan now. "You want to tell these people who you are?" Ethan said nothing. He adjusted the strap on his pack. "Because what I can tell them," Wade said, filling the silence with practiced ease, "is that this man showed up here with a dog and a bag and nothing else. No job. No family. No plan. Just passing through, right? Except he never passed through. He just found somewhere quiet to eat up resources and disappear. And I think the people of this town deserve to know when somebody's taking advantage." One of the men near the hardware store laughed. It was a short, dismissive sound, not cruel exactly, but comfortable in the way that dismissal is comfortable when it costs nothing. Most of the others stayed silent, which was worse in its own way because silence in a moment like that is a form of agreement. Ethan looked at Wade. He looked at him steadily, with the pale blue eyes that had stared down things in the dark that Wade Mercer would not have survived for 10 seconds, and he said, quietly and without heat, "I'll go." That was all. Ghost turned with him as he moved, and the two of them walked away from the shop front and down the sidewalk toward the end of Main Street and the road that ran north toward the mountain, and nobody called after him, and nobody offered anything, and the people who had been watching turned back to their errands like the moment had been nothing more than a minor interruption in the morning. The teenager on the bicycle watched them the longest. Then he rode away. Ethan did not look back at the town. He had learned in his years of service that looking back at things that had already rejected you was a waste of energy and eyesight. You kept your eyes forward and you kept your feet moving and you managed what was in front of you, not what was behind. Ghost moved at his left side on a loose lead, ears alert, nose working the cold air in that particular way he had when he was processing information rather than reacting to it. The wind was picking up now, coming down off the ridge with real force, and Ethan could feel it through his olive field jacket even with the thermal layers beneath it. He pulled his old gloves tighter and kept walking. The road north out of Elk Ridge climbed gradually for the first half-mile, and then turned sharply west toward the base of the mountain slope where the old mining trails began. There were 3 established routes above town: the Forest Service path, which was maintained through early November and then left to the snow; the Eastern Switchback, which was popular with summer hikers and completely impassable in winter; and what locals called the Upper Flats Trail, which wasn't really a trail at all but a series of old survey markers and broken fence posts that followed the ridgeline above the tree line and connected to a series of abandoned claim sites from the town's mining past. Nobody used the Upper Flats in winter. Nobody had reason to. Ethan was not going there for a reason. He was going there because it was the only direction the town had left him. He walked for 40 minutes in silence before the weight of the morning fully settled into his chest, and when it did not arrive as anger or as self-pity but as something quieter and more absolute. A kind of recognition. He had been here before, not in this specific geography, not in this specific cold, but in this particular state of having nothing and no one and no path forward that made any immediate sense. He had been here the night of the accident, standing in a hospital corridor, while a nurse explained in a kind and careful voice that his son Marcus had not survived the collision, and his wife Claire, who had been driving, had survived but would not be the same woman again in any way that would include him in her life. He had been here in the weeks after the funeral, sitting in their house with Ghost pressed against his legs, trying to understand how a man who had spent his career in the most extreme circumstances imaginable could have failed to protect the 2 people he loved most from a stretch of black ice on a highway 40 minutes from home. He had been here. He would move through it. That was what he knew how to do. Ghost walked beside him without noise, his white coat gathering fine crystals of blown snow along his shoulders and the crest of his head, his dark eyes scanning the slope above them with steady, professional attention. The dog had his own grief, in whatever form animals carry it. He had loved Marcus too. Had slept at the foot of his bed during visits, had tolerated the boy's enthusiastic hugs with a patience he showed almost no one else, had pressed his nose against the car window on long drives with a contentment that was clearly about the company rather than the destination. But Ghost did not collapse under grief. He adapted. He stayed present. He kept working. In many ways, Ghost had taught Ethan more about surviving loss than any human being or any program or any therapist had managed. The trail above town was buried under 18 inches of compressed snow, and Ethan moved through it with the methodical efficiency of a man who had spent years covering hard ground under difficult conditions. He tested each step before committing his weight, read the slope above him for signs of instability, kept track of the wind direction and the rate at which visibility was declining. The storm was coming faster now. He could feel it in the pressure change, in the way the snow was beginning to move sideways rather than fall straight, in the particular silence that precedes heavy weather in the mountains, a silence that isn't peaceful but suspended, like the pause before something very loud. He was thinking about shelter. The trees thickened about a quarter-mile above the main road and offered some protection from direct wind, and he had a bivouac set up in his pack that could sustain him through a serious night if he found the right position, a windbreak, some elevation above the drainage, something solid at his back. He was running calculations without emotion, the way he had been trained, because emotion in survival situations was a budget item you couldn't afford to spend until you had the basics covered. And then Ghost stopped. Not slowed. Not hesitated. Stopped completely, all 4 feet planted, nose down, the handle on his tactical jacket standing up like a flag in the wind. Ethan stopped with him. He watched the dog for a moment without speaking. Ghost had his nose pressed against a section of the slope where the snow had accumulated in a deep drift against what appeared to be an outcropping of rock and old timber. The dog sniffed in long, controlled draws, the kind of dedicated scenting work that indicated he had found something with a distinct odor signature, not just a smell on the wind but something rising from a specific source. Then he circled. He moved 3 feet to the left, and then back to the right, nose never lifting, describing an arc that Ethan recognized as the pattern of a dog trying to locate the epicenter of something beneath the surface. Ghost. Ethan said his name quietly. The dog looked up at him for exactly 1 second and then went back to work. Ethan watched for another 30 seconds. In training and in field work, Ghost had made this motion, this circling, this dedicated ground scenting, in response to two things: buried human beings and the chemical signatures of specific materials used in the construction of weapons and containment structures. Those two categories were very different from each other, and Ethan had learned to distinguish between them by reading the dog's body posture. When Ghost was tracking human scent, body heat, carbon dioxide, the biological signature of a living person under compression, he moved faster, more urgently, his breathing audible. When he was tracking the second category, he moved more deliberately, almost mechanically, like a technician following a procedure. Right now, he was moving like a technician. Ethan set his pack down and pulled off his gloves and knelt at the point where Ghost's nose kept returning. He pressed his bare hands into the snow and felt it, faint but real, a differential in temperature. Not body heat. Something else. The snow directly above this point was fractionally warmer than the snow on either side, which meant there was a heat source below, or at least a sealed space with less cold air penetration than the surrounding slope. Ethan looked up at the rock formation above the drift. It was irregular, broken, covered in old timber and vine growth that had frozen solid over multiple seasons, but there was a geometry to it that the surrounding terrain didn't share. Straight edges, partially obscured. Right angles under the snow. He picked up his gloves and put them back on and looked at Ghost. Ghost was staring at the exact center of the drift. "All right," Ethan said. He pulled a folding utility tool from his pack and started digging. He dug for 18 minutes. The snow came away in packed layers, each one denser than the last, the kind of accumulation that happens over multiple storms rather than a single event. Beneath the third layer he hit something with the blade of the tool that gave a dull metallic ring, and he cleared more carefully after that, working with his hands as much as the blade, brushing rather than cutting, until he had exposed a surface that was unmistakably manufactured. Steel. Old, corroded at the edges, painted once in a color that had faded to a uniform rust gray, but structural. Deliberate. He cleared more snow. A frame appeared. Then an edge. Then the outline of a door, not a mine shaft opening, not a drainage culvert, but an actual engineered door set into the mountain slope at a slight angle, sealed with a heavy bar mechanism that had been locked from the outside. The door was approximately 4 feet wide and 6 feet tall, recessed into a frame of poured concrete that had been camouflaged with rock facing and then buried, obviously intentionally, under decades of debris and weather. Ethan sat back on his heels in the snow and looked at it. Ghost sat beside him and looked at it too. "What is this?" Ethan said. It was not a question. It was the kind of statement a man makes when his mind is already working through the implications and his voice just needs somewhere to put the surplus. The bar mechanism was old but not impossible. The locking rod had corroded into a partial bind, but the cold had also contracted the metal slightly, which in certain mechanisms works in your favor. Ethan worked it for 4 minutes with the utility tool and the heel of his palm, and then it gave way with a sound that was half groan and half crack, and the door swung outward on hinges that shrieked with the protest of metal that had not moved in a very long time. Cold air breathed out from the darkness inside. Cold, but different from outside cold. Sealed cold. The cold of an enclosed space that has been maintaining its own temperature separate from the external environment. And within that cold something else, the dry, mineral smell of old concrete and preserved materials, the particular odor of a space that has been airtight for a long time. Ghost moved to the threshold and stood there, nose working, reading whatever was inside with the focused patience of a dog who does not rush into dark spaces until he has gathered enough information. Then he looked back at Ethan, ears forward. Ethan turned on the small tactical flashlight clipped to his pack strap and ducked through the entrance. What was inside stopped him after 3 steps. He had expected a mine shaft, a utility tunnel, a drainage structure. Something simple and functional and explained by the practical history of a mining town in the Montana mountains. What he found instead was a chamber, high-ceilinged, at least 9 feet from floor to rough-cut beam ceiling, running back into the mountain for a distance that the flashlight beam couldn't fully resolve. The walls were concrete and timber, reinforced at intervals with structural columns that had been poured rather than assembled, suggesting professional engineering rather than improvised construction. Along the left wall ran a series of built-in storage units, sealed metal cabinets of the kind used in government and military installations, their doors still closed, their surfaces marked with faded labels that Ethan moved toward without thinking. He read the labels in the flashlight beam. Emergency rations, water purification, medical supplies, fuel canisters, communications equipment, structural repair materials, emergency lighting. He stood very still. Ghost moved past him into the chamber and began a slow, systematic sweep of the space, nose low, the way he had been trained to clear a room, methodically, corner by corner, no rush, no reaction until the full picture had been assembled. Ethan moved the flashlight across the ceiling. The ventilation system was up there, a series of pipes and baffled openings that ran toward the surface and were designed to allow airflow without admitting weather. It was functional. The faint movement of air against his face confirmed it. The system was passive, gravity-driven, still operating after however many decades this place had been sealed. He moved the light to the right wall. More storage. A folded canvas arrangement that resolved, as he looked closer, into a series of cots, collapsible military-style bunks, stacked and secured against the wall. Enough for at least 8 people. Possibly 12. He moved the light back to the rear of the chamber. There was a corridor back there. A sealed door, smaller than the entrance, set into the rear wall at a point where the chamber narrowed. The door was secured with the same bar mechanism as the entrance, still locked. Ghost had completed his sweep and returned to Ethan's side. He sat and looked up at him. "Nobody in here," Ethan said quietly, reading the dog's body language. "Not alive, anyway." Ghost held his gaze. "Okay," Ethan said. He stood in the underground chamber in the beam of his flashlight, and he breathed the mineral, sealed air of the place, and he understood for the first time in weeks that he was not going to die tonight. The storm outside could do what it wanted. The town below could do what it wanted. He had shelter. He had walls between himself and the wind. He had air that moved. And depending on what was in those sealed metal cabinets, he had resources. He set his pack down on the concrete floor and got to work. The first cabinet he opened required the utility tool along the hinge seam because the seal had partially bonded over time, but once it came free the contents were dry and intact. Emergency ration packages, the dense, high-calorie military specification blocks that tasted like nothing but kept a body alive and functional. He counted enough for a week for one person, possibly longer. He set them on the floor and moved to the next cabinet. Water purification tablets. 2 sealed filtration units still in their original packaging. A collapsible reservoir tank, rolled tight. Medical supplies. He opened this cabinet carefully and examined the contents methodically: bandages, wound closure strips, antiseptic in sealed pouches, and 4 kits still in its sterile package, a pharmaceutical selection that had partially degraded but included useful components, a manual that identified the contents of the kit as a Level 2 trauma response package. He found the fuel canisters in the 4th cabinet, sealed, pressurized, the kind designed for emergency heating elements, and in the same cabinet, a small radiant heater unit, compact, efficient, designed for enclosed spaces. He read the instructions on the side panel, found the activation sequence, and within 10 minutes had the heater running at its lowest setting, which was sufficient to begin pushing the temperature of the chamber up from brutal to merely cold. Ghost lay down near the heater and closed his eyes but kept his ears rotating, monitoring the space the way working dogs do even at rest, never fully off, never fully down, the alertness just cycling to a lower register, while the body recovered. Ethan ate one ration block and drank water he had filtered through the portable unit from snow he collected just inside the entrance, and he sat on the concrete floor with his back against the cold wall and looked at the chamber around him and thought about what this place was. It was not a mine. He had been in mines. He had cleared mines in operational contexts, crawled through old shafts in training exercises, studied underground construction in the engineering components of his SEAL qualification courses. Mines had a particular grammar: low ceilings, timber shoring, ore cart tracks, drainage channels, the specific smell of blasted rock and water seep. This place had none of that grammar. This place had a different grammar entirely. This was built for habitation. Built for survival. Built with the kind of deliberate, planned engineering that you associated with civil defense infrastructure, emergency preparedness programs, the kind of projects that had been common in certain American communities during the middle decades of the 20th century when the threat of large-scale catastrophe, natural or man-made, had driven a particular kind of institutional planning. Someone had built this as a place to bring people when everything above ground went wrong. And someone had then sealed it, and hidden it, and buried it under the mountain slope, and nobody in the town below had apparently said a word about it for decades. Ethan looked at the sealed rear corridor door. There was more back there. He could feel it. The chamber he was in was large, but the footprint of the structure suggested a deeper layout, multiple rooms, possibly, or a longer corridor running back into the mountain along the same axis as the entrance. Ghost had registered something near that door during his sweep, a particular stillness that the dog adopted when he had identified an area of interest he had not yet fully investigated. He would open it. Not tonight. Tonight was for survival maintenance, getting warm, getting fed, assessing conditions, monitoring the storm. The corridor would wait. Outside, the wind had reached a pitch that was audible even through the concrete walls and the packed snow above. It came in waves, the gusts cycling in a pattern that Ethan recognized as the leading edge of a serious system, the irregular rhythm of a storm still organizing itself, building from the northwest, gathering force over the open terrain before it compressed against the mountain wall and detonated into the valley below. Elk Ridge was going to take a direct hit. Ethan sat in the warmth of the small heater and listened to the storm beginning above him, and Ghost breathed steadily near his feet, and the chamber held its own quiet against the violence building outside, and for the first time in a very long time, Ethan Cade was in a position to think rather than just survive. He thought about the door he'd opened. He thought about the labels on the cabinets. He thought about the engineering of the ventilation system and the quality of the concrete work and the specific type of storage cabinets, and the number of cots along the wall. He thought about the sealed rear corridor and what Ghost had registered there. And he thought about the town below him, and the people in it, and the storm that was building over all of them. He did not think about Wade Mercer yet. That would come later. Right now he thought about the school. There was a school in Elk Ridge. He had passed it twice during his weeks in town, a single-story building at the east end of Main Street with a playground behind it that had been buried under a foot of snow since late November. There were children in that school. There were families in that town. There were people who had been unkind to him and people who had been kind and more people who had simply looked away, and none of that changed the fundamental calculation that was beginning to assemble itself in his mind as the storm intensified and the temperature outside continued to fall. He had been trained to protect people. That training did not come with an exceptions clause. It did not come with a line that said, unless those people have been cruel to you, unless they have dismissed you, unless they have let a man they did not understand stand in the cold with everything he owned on his back while they went about their morning without offering so much as a hot cup of coffee. The training did not have those exceptions because the people who developed that training understood something essential about the human heart under pressure, that the instinct to protect does not wait to assess whether the person in danger deserves protection. It just moves. Ghost opened his eyes and looked at Ethan. Not yet, Ethan told him. Let me think. Ghost held his gaze for a moment, then lowered his head back onto his paws without closing his eyes. The storm built outside. Back in town, the morning had continued in the way that small mountain towns continue through the early stages of a developing storm, with awareness but not yet alarm, with the particular rhythm of a community that has survived hard winters before and trusts its infrastructure and its routines to carry it through whatever the sky chose to deliver. The power had flickered twice in the morning, just briefly, just enough to make the overhead lights in the diner and the hardware store dim and then recover, which was not unusual at this elevation in winter, but which the lineman who had been at the coffee counter at the time had noted without entirely dismissing. Mara Bell had been at the dispatch station since 6 that morning. She had taken the early shift because 2 of her regular volunteers had come down with the respiratory illness that had been moving through town since Thanksgiving, and because she was the kind of person who filled gaps without being asked and without expecting acknowledgement. She was 34 and had been involved with search and rescue in Elk Ridge for 7 years, starting as a trainee and eventually becoming the most operationally experienced dispatcher the small department had, which in a town this size meant she wore about 4 different hats and had keys to about 6 different buildings and kept track of more variables at any given moment than most people would have found manageable. She had heard about the incident on Main Street that morning. In Elk Ridge, you heard about everything. The town was small enough that information traveled on the wind like weather, and by 9:30 she had 3 separate accounts of Wade Mercer standing on the sidewalk and calling out the homeless vet who had been sleeping in his storage shed. She had not been present. She had been at her desk running a weather update cross-check with the State Emergency Management Portal, watching the storm system develop on the radar overlay with the focused attention of someone who had seen these mountains do terrible things to overconfident communities. What she felt about the incident on Main Street was complicated. She had seen Ethan around town. She had observed him in the specific, professional way that she observed anything that might become a search and rescue problem, with attention to his physical condition, his gear, his apparent orientation, his mental state as expressed through movement and behavior. What she had seen was a man who was depleted but not destabilized. A man with military bearing that had been weathered but not eroded. A man with a dog that was clearly operational rather than merely a pet, the tactical jacket, the controlled movement, the way the animal responded to the man's body language with precision that you only developed through serious training. She had thought, that man knows what he's doing. Whatever happened to him, he knows what he's doing. And then the storm data had pulled her attention back to the screen, because what was developing to the northwest was not a regular winter system. The satellite imagery showed a pressure differential that the meteorological models were flagging with the kind of language that emergency managers paid close attention to: sustained wind projections in the upper range, snowfall accumulation estimates that would strain the infrastructure of a town like Elk Ridge within hours of onset, temperature projections that pushed well below safe exposure thresholds. She had started making calls at 9:45. The school principal, the roads department, the county emergency coordinator, the hospital in the next town over to give them advance notice. Wade Mercer, because his outfitter's shop was the largest private structure in town with the best generator capacity, and she had used it as an overflow shelter twice before. Wade had answered on the second ring and had spent most of the 3-minute conversation talking about his property, and his equipment, and his schedule before getting around to asking whether the storm was really as serious as she was making it sound. "Yes," Mara had said. "It really is." "All right," Wade had said. "We'll see what happens." She had hung up and gone back to the radar and thought about the man with the white dog walking up the mountain road in the rising wind. She had thought, I should have done something. I should have said something to someone. I should have called out to him this morning or gone to Main Street when I heard what was happening and what? Offered him what? Her couch? Her spare room? She had a small house and a busy life, and she had watched the same thing the rest of the town had watched, which was a man being dismissed and not intervening. She had pushed the thought aside and gone back to the storm data, because that was what was immediately actionable, and she was good at prioritizing the immediately actionable. By 11 that morning, the wind had increased enough to begin moving snow off the upper slopes in visible streamers, long white plumes that trailed eastward over the ridge line like torn flags. The school had canceled afternoon activities and moved to an early pickup protocol. The roads department had activated their plow rotation and positioned sand trucks at the 3 main intersections leading out of town. 2 of the valley ranches had called in to say they were bringing their livestock into the covered barns and would not be accessible by road after noon. And at 11:20, the mountain pass to the east, the only paved road connecting Elk Ridge to the larger highway system, was closed. The town was sealed. Mara had expected this. She had noted the closure on the situation board and called the county to confirm and then begun updating her resource inventory. Available shelter space, emergency fuel, medical supplies, number of residents unaccounted for or in exposed conditions. It was the last category that kept pulling at something in the back of her mind, the way an unresolved variable in a calculation keeps surfacing no matter how many other numbers you run. One of her volunteers, a young man named Curtis who operated the snowmobile and handled trail assessments in difficult conditions, had come into the dispatch station around noon with snow on his jacket, and said, "Hey, did you hear about the guy Wade threw out this morning? The vet?" "I heard," Mara said. "He walked up toward the mountain. Toward the upper flats, looked like." Curtis shook his head. "In this." "I know," Mara said. "Should we?" "He's military trained," Mara said. "White Shepherd, full tactical kit. He's not a civilian without resources." She said it because it was true. She said it also because resources were already thin and the storm was accelerating and she had 17 confirmed vulnerables on her list, and not enough personnel to cover all of them. Curtis nodded and went to make coffee. Mara looked at the weather radar for a long moment. Then she looked at the door. Then she went back to the radar and kept working, and the storm kept building, and the mountain kept its silence above the town. The afternoon arrived in layers of gray and white, each layer pressing harder than the one before it. By 1 o'clock the visibility on Main Street had dropped to under 100 yards. By 2 o'clock the secondary roads through the residential areas were impassable without four-wheel drive. By 2:30 the power had gone out for 12 minutes and come back on at reduced capacity, which the town's aging grid did sometimes under heavy load, and the generator in the community center had been activated as a precaution. And at 3:15, the call came and that changed everything. The school transport, a heavy-duty van that ran a route through the 3 miles of valley road between the school and the eastern residential cluster, had gone off the road at the point where the valley crossed under the old mining ridge. The driver had lost traction on a section of road that the plow rotation had not yet reached, and the van had slid sideways into the drainage cut, and was wedged at an angle that made it impossible for the occupants to exit safely from either side. There were 7 children inside and the driver, and the drainage cut was deep enough that the undercarriage was taking the weight of the van on an angle that could become unstable if the vehicle shifted. The temperature outside was -12 and falling. Mara had the call from the driver in her earpiece and a GPS position on her screen, and Curtis already pulling on his jacket before the driver had finished his second sentence. "Road access?" she said into her radio. "Blocked," came the response from the plow truck driver. "The cut's under 4 feet. Won't be passable for 2 hours minimum. Maybe more." "Snowmobile approach?" "Possible from the west ridge." Curtis could get close. "Not close enough to extract 8 people." Mara pulled up the shelter map on her second screen. The community center was at capacity with the early arriving families who had come in from the exposed rural areas. The school building had lost auxiliary heating and was running on the backup electric system, which was functional for now but not rated for extended occupancy in these conditions. Wade's outfitter shop was the largest covered space with independent power, and she had already allocated its ground floor to the medical overflow and the elderly residents who had been brought in from the valley side. There were no resources left to spare. "How long can they stay in the van?" she said. "Driver says heat is still running," Curtis said. "But the angle is—" "I know the angle." She had looked at the GPS position. The drainage cut ran under the old mining ridge, and the north face of that ridge had two unstable sections that the County Geological Survey had flagged as high risk in the last assessment. If the storm loaded them with enough additional weight, and the wind pressure continued at current levels, there was a non-trivial probability that one of those sections would shed an avalanche. A small one, by mountain standards. More than large enough to bury a van and everyone in it. She pulled up the weather radar again. The storm center was still an hour from direct overhead. The heaviest loading was still coming. "Curtis," she said. "Yeah." "Get to the West Ridge. Get eyes on the transport. Tell me exactly what you see. Do not approach the drainage cut from above." "Copy," Curtis said, and he was out the door. Mara sat in the dispatch station and looked at her situation board and ran the numbers one more time, and the numbers came up the same way they had the first time. She did not have enough. Not enough shelter, not enough personnel, not enough routes, not enough time. And somewhere on the mountain above all of this, there was a man and a white dog who had been pushed out into the cold that morning, and she had no way of knowing if they were alive. She picked up her radio. Ethan had been underground for approximately 6 hours when ghost ears came up in the sharp, precise way they did when the dog had registered something specific rather than ambient. He was lying near the heater, and Ethan was examining the sealed rear corridor door, turning over the implications of the engineering he had been studying for the past hour, the ventilation design, the load-bearing calculations implied by the column spacing, the specific gauge of the steel cabinets. And Ghost's ear movement was distinct enough from his resting alertness that Ethan set down what he was doing and turned. Ghost was on his feet now, facing the entrance door. Ethan moved to the entrance and pressed his ear against the cold metal. The storm sound outside was immense, a sustained roar broken by irregular gusts that created pressure waves even through the sealed door and the packed snow above. He listened inside the storm for what Ghost had heard. And then he heard it. Faint, directional, coming from the lower slope, a sound that was not wind and not snow and not any of the organic noises of a mountain in a heavy storm. A mechanical sound. Something human-made. A vehicle, possibly at a distance. Or something structural failing. Or... He opened the entrance door 3 inches, bracing it against the wind pressure, and the sound came in clearly for a moment before the gusts swallowed it. It was not a vehicle. It was voices. Not close. Not panicked, exactly, but urgent, the elevated, compressed cadence of people in a bad situation who have not yet reached full fear but are close to it. Ghost pushed his nose through the gap and drew one long, deliberate breath. Then he looked at Ethan. Ethan held the door open for another 30 seconds, triangulating the direction of the sound against the slope geography he had studied on the way up that morning. The voices were coming from the northeast, lower on the ridge, in the direction of the valley road that ran between the school and the eastern residential area. He closed the door and stood in the underground chamber and looked at Ghost. Ghost was looking at the entrance. Then at Ethan. Then at the entrance. Ethan stood very still for a moment. He thought about the town. He thought about the morning. He thought about Wade Mercer's voice, loud and deliberate, on the main street sidewalk with its audience arranged around it. He thought about the laughter from the man near the hardware store. He thought about the silence from everyone else. And then he thought about the sound of children's voices. Because that was what it was, mixed in with the adult urgency, pitched higher, shorter, the particular compressed sound of children trying to be brave in a situation they did not fully understand. Ghost made a sound. Not a bark. Something quieter and more specific, the soft, directed vocalization that the dog used when he needed Ethan to stop thinking and start moving. Ethan pulled on his pack. He checked his gloves. He checked his emergency kit. He looked at the heater and at the open storage cabinets, and at the rows of cots against the wall, and he thought about how many people those cots could hold and how many ration packs were in the first cabinet, and how the ventilation system could sustain a full occupancy load, and the numbers were good. The numbers were actually very good. "Okay," he said to Ghost. He was not entirely sure whether he was saying it to the dog or to himself or to the empty air of the chamber or to whatever it was that had put him on this mountain slope on this particular morning with this particular storm arriving. Okay. He opened the door and went back into the blizzard. The cold hit him like a wall. Not the gradual cold of exposure but the immediate, total cold of a storm at its developing edge, wind-driven, penetrating, the kind of cold that finds every gap in your clothing within the first 30 seconds and begins working on the skin beneath. He pulled his collar up and kept his chin down and moved out from the entrance onto the slope with Ghost at his heel, and the snow was blowing horizontally now in sheets that reduced visibility to 20 feet at best, and then dropped it further in the heavy gusts. Ghost moved without hesitation. He was not tracking a scent in the conventional sense. The wind was too chaotic for ground-level scent work, but he was using his directional hearing in the way trained dogs do in noisy environments, triangulating the sound source through the interference of the storm with the same focused methodology he used in any difficult environment. He moved northeast along the slope, cutting across the face of the mountain at a diagonal that Ethan recognized as the optimal approach angle, not directly into the wind, which would have reduced their speed and compromised both of their perceptions, but at an angle that let them use the terrain for partial coverage while maintaining heading. Ethan followed the dog. They moved for 12 minutes through the blizzard, 12 minutes that were among the harder physical experiences of Ethan's recent life, which was saying something. The snow depth on the open slope was inconsistent, calf-deep in some sections, waist-deep where it had drifted, and in one section near a collapsed section of old fence line, over Ethan's hips, which required a full stop and a change of route. Ghost handled the deep sections without difficulty, his powerful legs and broad chest cutting through the accumulation with the efficiency of an animal built for exactly this kind of terrain. And then Ghost stopped and pointed, not with a trained formal point but with his entire body, nose forward, ears locked, weight forward on his front feet, the unmistakable posture of a dog who has found what he was looking for. Ethan looked where Ghost was pointing. The school transport van was visible through the blowing snow at a distance of roughly 40 feet, a dark shape listing at a severe angle into the drainage cut, its rear wheels partially off the ground, its headlights still burning a weak amber through the white. He could hear the engine running. He could see condensation on the interior windows, which meant heat and occupants. He could also see, as he moved closer and the geometry became clearer, that the van was resting on the cut bank in a way that was actively deteriorating, the near side wheels slowly sinking through the frozen surface of the bank as the weight of the vehicle continued to compress it. He came around to the driver's window and knocked. The face that appeared was young, 30s, male, the compressed expression of someone who had been managing fear for the better part of an hour and was near the end of his reserve. The window went down 2 inches. "Who are?" "Ethan Cade," Ethan said. "I'm going to get you out." "How many kids?" 7. 8 total. The bank is. "I see the bank. Can any of them walk?" "They're kids. They're scared." "The little ones?" "How little is the littlest?" 6. "Twins. They're. Okay." Ethan was already moving to the side door of the van, pulling it open, bracing himself against the vehicle's angle. The blast of warm air from inside mixed with the storm cold in a sudden, sharp contrast. Inside, 7 faces, ranging from what he estimated as 6 to 12 years old, staring at him with the specific expression that children have when they have been frightened for a sustained period and then a stranger appears and they are not yet sure whether the stranger is a solution or an additional problem. Ghost appeared beside Ethan at the door, white coat blazing against the gray storm, and several of the children's expressions shifted immediately toward the second category, the dog category, the category that small humans instinctively recognized as safe. "Hi," Ghost said, in the language of dogs, by pressing his nose forward into the van interior and wagging his tail once, slowly, which was apparently sufficient, because the nearest child, a girl of about 8 with a red knit hat pulled down over her ears, reached out and touched Ghost's nose with her mitten. "We're going to walk," Ethan told the children. His voice was calm and level and carried the precise amount of authority required, enough to generate compliance without generating additional fear. It's going to be cold. It's going to be hard. But we are going to walk to a safe place, and Ghost is going to lead us, and I need everyone to hold on to the person next to you and not let go. Can we do that? 7 faces looked at him. Then at Ghost. Then back at him. The girl with the red hat said, "Is that your dog?" "Yes," Ethan said. "What's his name?" "Ghost." She considered this. "That's a good name," she said. "Yeah," Ethan said. "It is. Can you hold his jacket strap while we walk?" She grabbed the handle on Ghost's tactical jacket with both mittened hands, and Ghost held completely still while she did it, and Ethan began moving the children out of the van. The driver came last, and Ethan helped him out and took stock of his condition, cold, shaken, functional, and then looked at the drainage cut bank where the van's near side wheels had sunk another inch since he had arrived. "Don't look at it," Ethan told the driver. "Just walk." They moved across the slope in a line, Ghost at the front with the girl in the red hat holding his jacket handle, Ethan at the rear, the driver somewhere in the middle counting heads in the way drivers count heads, which is obsessively and continuously. The wind worked against them, but Ghost held his line without deviation, pulling the column of children through the deepest snow with the steady, unhurried authority of a dog who had done harder things than this and knew the difference between difficult and impossible. It took 22 minutes to reach the underground entrance. Ethan went in first and turned the heater up and lit the second lighting unit he had found in one of the storage cabinets, a battery-powered LED array that flooded the chamber with clean white light, and then came back to the entrance and guided the children inside one by one. Ghost stood at the door and let each child touch him briefly on the way in, which seemed, for reasons Ethan didn't entirely analyze, to be important to each of them. When everyone was inside and the door was closed against the storm, the silence of the underground was extraordinary. After 20 minutes of blizzard, the sealed chamber felt almost impossibly still. The children stood in the warm light and looked at the concrete walls and the rows of storage cabinets, and the folded cots and the heater making its gentle orange glow, and several of them started crying, not from fear now but from the physical release of having been cold and frightened and then suddenly warm and safe. Ghost moved among them, steady and slow, pressing his broad white head against whoever seemed to need it most. The driver was on his phone. No signal. He looked at Ethan. "There won't be signal in here," Ethan said. "We're under about 30 feet of mountain. We need to contact." "I know. Let's get them settled first." Ethan was already pulling the first set of cots from the wall, unfolding them, setting them up with the efficient speed of someone who had made operational camps in worse conditions. "Help me with these." The driver helped. Outside, the storm raged on over Elk Ridge. And below, in the dispatch station on Main Street, Mara Bell had been trying for 40 minutes to raise the school transport driver on every frequency she had, and getting nothing, and Curtis was still on the West Ridge and could see the van in the drainage cut but could not safely approach, and the situation board was full of red markers, and she had run out of good options. She was on the phone with the county emergency coordinator when Curtis's voice came through her radio, tight with something that wasn't quite surprise but was close to it. "Mara," Curtis said. "The van. It's..." "What?" "It's empty. The side door is open. They're gone. All 8 of them. There are tracks in the snow but the wind is covering them fast. The tracks go up slope, not down. They go toward the..." A long pause. "They go toward the old upper flats." Mara set down the phone. She sat very still for a moment. Then she said quietly, to no one in particular, "He found something up there." She stood up. She pulled on her jacket. She found the map of the upper mining trails on the secondary shelf where it had been filed years ago and never used, and she spread it on the dispatch desk and looked at the topography of the slope above town, and she looked at the section of Upper Flats Trail where an old geological survey notation marked the location of what the survey had called anomalous subsurface construction, origin unknown, likely pre-1960, access sealed. She had seen that notation before. She had always assumed it referred to a drainage culvert or an old mining utility structure. She had never followed up on it. There had never been a reason. She folded the map. She picked up her radio. She called Curtis. "Can you follow the tracks?" "Barely," Curtis said. "But yeah, I think so." "Follow them," Mara said. "Don't go in anywhere without calling me first." "What do I tell people here?" Curtis said. "Wade's asking about resources. He wants to know." "Tell Wade I'm working on it," Mara said. And she walked out the door into the storm. She had been moving through blizzards in this valley for 7 years. She knew the rhythm of it, the way the wind came in waves, the way you used the terrain to interrupt the gusts, the way you kept your eyes down and your pace steady, and you didn't think about how far you had to go, but only about the next step. She moved up the main road and then off it onto the lower trail approach, following the markers she had memorized from years of summer SAR training. And the snow was deep and the wind was savage, and she was cold within the first 5 minutes despite her gear. But she kept moving. Because there were 8 people somewhere on this mountain, and because a man she had watched walk away this morning had apparently gone back out into the worst storm in years to find them, and that meant she was going to find him. She had been climbing for 35 minutes when she saw the light. Not a beam, a glow. Faint, rising from the slope above her, diffused through the snow covering the entrance like a lantern through a curtain. She stopped and looked at it, and looked at the map in her hand and looked at the survey notation, and then she moved toward it, and she found the entrance, and she found the door, and she knocked. The door opened from inside. Ethan looked at her for a moment. He was holding a LED lighting unit in one hand and his expression was unreadable in the way of someone who has been through enough that surprise has become difficult to access. "You found them," Mara said. It was not a question. "They're inside," Ethan said. 8. All functional. Come in before you lose more heat." She came in. The chamber was warm. It was improbably, remarkably warm, the heater doing its work against the mass of the mountain's insulation. The children were on the cots, several of them asleep already, the others sitting in small quiet clusters with the post-adrenaline stillness of children who have been frightened and then reassured. The driver was awake in the corner, looking at the walls with the expression of someone who still was not sure what this place was. Ghost was lying in the center of the space with 2 children using him as a pillow, his eyes half open, his breathing steady. Mara stood in the entrance of the underground chamber and looked at all of it, the walls, the storage cabinets, the ventilation system, the cots, the heater, the light, and something in her expression shifted in the way things shift when a person confronts the difference between what they expected and what they found. "What is this place?" she said. "I don't know yet," Ethan said. "But it's keeping them alive. And there's capacity for more." He looked at her steadily. "How many more people does the town need to shelter?" Mara pulled out her radio and looked at the situation board image she had photographed before leaving. She counted. She thought about the additional stranded families on the valley road, the 3 households on the North Ridge that had called in as cut off, the 2 vehicles that had gone off the road on the western approach during the early afternoon and whose occupants had been redirected toward town but not yet confirmed as arrived. She looked up at Ethan. "More than we have room for," she said. "Or we did have room for." Ethan nodded once. He turned and looked at the rear corridor door. "There's more back there," he said. Ghost raised his head from the sleeping children and looked at the corridor door. Ethan walked to it and began working the bar mechanism. The bar mechanism on the rear corridor door was older than the one on the entrance. The corrosion ran deeper. The metal had contracted and expanded through enough seasonal cycles to partially weld the rod to its housing, and Ethan worked it for 6 minutes with the utility tool before it gave way. The sound it made when it released was a deep, resonant crack that bounced off the concrete walls and brought Ghost to his feet and made two of the sleeping children stir without waking. Mara stood behind Ethan with her own flashlight beam added to his, and when the door swung inward the combined light reached down a corridor that ran straight back into the mountain for what the beam suggested was at least 60 feet before curving out of sight. The air that came out was colder than the main chamber but drier, the particular dry cold of a sealed space with no moisture source, the kind of air that preserves rather than degrades. Ethan stepped inside and the floor under his boots was smooth concrete, clean, intact, with none of the cracking or heaving that showed up in structures that had experienced significant water infiltration. The walls were the same poured concrete as the main chamber but finished more carefully here. The surface was smoother, the corners more precise, the construction quality a level above what you'd find in a utility structure. This had been built with more care than the entrance chamber. Built for something more specific. Ghost moved past him down the corridor, nose low, performing his sweep with the quiet efficiency he brought to every new space. His white coat glowed in the flashlight beam against the gray concrete walls. Mara came in behind Ethan and they walked in silence, both of their lights moving across the walls and the floor and the ceiling, reading the space the way people who know how to read spaces do, looking for load indicators, structural signals, the narrative that a built environment tells about its purpose. The corridor curved left after 60 feet, and beyond the curve it opened into a second chamber. Mara stopped. The second chamber was larger than the first. Significantly larger. The ceiling was higher, 12 feet at its peak, and the floor plan was roughly rectangular, perhaps 40 feet across and 60 feet deep. Along the far wall ran a double row of storage units that made the first chamber's cabinets look like a preliminary sketch. There were communications panels mounted at intervals along the right wall, old technology, rotary dial emergency radio equipment, telephone handsets on wall brackets, panel switches and indicator lights, all of it sealed and preserved under dust covers. Along the left wall there were more cots, far more, folded and stacked in configurations that suggested serious planning. This was not overnight capacity, this was week-long capacity. There was a water handling station, pipes connecting to what the design suggested was a pressurized cistern above, and a sanitation corridor branching off the main chamber at the far end. And in the center of the chamber, bolted to the concrete floor, there was a heavy steel table with a map surface under glass. Ethan crossed to the table and looked at the map. Mara came to stand beside him. The map was a topographic representation of the Elk Ridge Valley and the surrounding mountain terrain, dated in the lower right corner in faded ink, 1962. Drawn with the precision of a professional survey, overlaid with notations in a careful hand that marked the underground structure in blue, the town in black, the mountain approach routes in red, and a series of numbered grid references that connected specific surface points to features of the underground layout. Someone had spent real time on this map. Someone who understood the valley, the mountain, the terrain, and the relationship between them in the specific context of people needing to get from one to the other under emergency conditions. Mara leaned closer to the map. She was looking at something in the lower left quadrant, near the town grid. There was a property notation there, a parcel designation, a name, and a date. She read it twice before she said anything. "Mercer," she said. Her voice was flat. Ethan looked where she was looking. The notation read, Access Coordination, R.W. Mercer, Land Steward, designated 1962. Renewal, 1979. Renewal, 1991. Below that, in a different hand and darker ink that suggested a later edition, Quarterly Inspection Protocol Suspended, W.T. Mercer, 2003. Mara straightened up. She stood in the cold second chamber of the underground structure with her flashlight beam resting on the map table, and her face carrying the particular expression of a person assembling a picture they had not wanted to see but cannot stop assembling. "Wade's father," she said. "And then Wade." Ethan said nothing. He was reading the rest of the map notations. "This structure was built with federal civil defense funding," Mara said slowly, as she read the legend in the bottom corner of the map. 1961. It was registered as a community emergency shelter. It was supposed to be. She stopped. She read again. It was supposed to be maintained and accessible. There was a land stewardship agreement. The Mercer family was designated as the surface access coordinators because the entrance point fell within their property boundary after the 1958 land redistribution. She looked up. Wade suspended the inspection protocol in 2003. That means he stopped reporting on it. He stopped acknowledging it existed. Ethan looked at her. Why would he do that? Because in 2003, Mara said, and her voice was very controlled now in the way of someone managing real anger. Wade Mercer filed a land use expansion application with the county that included the surface area above this structure. He was trying to build a commercial trail access facility up here. He wanted to run guided hunting parties through the upper flats. If this structure was on the books as a registered federal shelter with an active stewardship designation, it would have triggered a review of his land use application. She paused. So he made it disappear. Ethan looked at the map. He looked at the storage units along the far wall. He looked at the cots and the communications panels and the water station and the sanitation corridor. He thought about the town below. He thought about the families in the community center, and the stranded vehicles on the valley road and the children asleep on the cots in the first chamber. He thought about the storm outside that was still building, still loading the slopes, still pressing its weight against the infrastructure of a small mountain town that had run out of room. He knew this was here, Ethan said. It was not a question. He knew, Mara said. They stood in the cold second chamber with the map between them, and Ghost moved through the far reaches of the room in his quiet, methodical sweep, his white coat a moving light in the dimness, and outside the mountain held its silence against the storm and the storm held its full weight against the mountain, and neither of them moved for a long moment. Then Ethan said, "How many people can this chamber hold?" Mara looked at the cots. She counted. She looked at the water station and the sanitation corridor. She looked at the communications panel and thought about the emergency radio equipment, and whether any of it was operational. She ran the numbers the way she ran numbers, quickly, methodically, without sentiment. 30. Maybe 40 in a sustained emergency. Combined with the first chamber? 50. Possibly more. Ethan picked up his pack. Then let's go get people. They went back through the corridor to the first chamber. Mara called Curtis on her radio. The signal was barely usable this deep under the mountain, but it pushed through in broken fragments, enough to transmit what mattered. She told him about the structure. She gave him the entrance coordinates and the approach route. She told him to start moving people up from town, the most vulnerable first, and to tell anyone who asked that they had found a shelter and it had capacity. She did not mention Wade Mercer. Not yet. Curtis's response came back in pieces through the static, but the core of it was clear, confirmed, moving. He'll need help navigating in this, Ethan said. He knows the mountain, Mara said. Not in this visibility. Ethan looked at Ghost. Send him coordinates and tell him to look for a white dog. He was already at the door. Ghost was already at his side, jacket handle up, ready. Mara watched Ethan open the entrance door and step back into the blizzard, and Ghost went with him, and the door closed behind them both, and the chamber held its warmth, and its light, and its sleeping children, and she stood alone in the underground structure that a man's selfishness had buried and a dog's instinct had found, and she began working the communications panel on the right wall to see what was still operational. The second rescue run was harder than the first. The storm had reached a different level during the hour Ethan had been underground. The wind's speed had increased to the point where sustained movement against it required real physical effort, and the snow was coming so heavily that Ghost's white coat was almost invisible against the general white of the air. Ethan tracked the dog by the dark shape of the tactical jacket, by the precision of his movement, by the way the shadow of him cut through the horizontal snow with the clean, unhesitating confidence of an animal that didn't navigate by sight alone. Curtis found them 20 minutes into the descent. He appeared out of the white with the disoriented, determined expression of a man who has been pushing through a mountain blizzard for an hour and is not entirely sure he is still on the right slope. When he saw Ghost, he stopped and stared, and Ghost held still in the wind for exactly long enough for Curtis to get his bearings, and then turned and moved upslope. "Follow the dog," Ethan said. "I'm going down for more people." Curtis nodded and turned to follow Ghost. Ethan kept descending. He made 3 trips up the mountain that night. 3 full trips through the blizzard, each one harder than the last, each one finding people that the town's official resources had run out of capacity to absorb. The second group was a family of 4 from the North Ridge, a couple in their 60s and their adult daughter and her young son, who had been sitting in their truck on the blocked road for 3 hours and were cold enough that the grandfather was no longer fully coherent. Ethan got them moving by the simple mechanism of beginning to move and letting them follow, which was often the most effective approach with people in early hypothermic confusion. Not explanation, not persuasion, just movement and a clear direction. Ghost led them up. The grandfather leaned on Ethan's arm for the last quarter mile, and said nothing except, at one point, near the entrance, "That's a beautiful dog." His voice was blurred with cold, but the observation was precise. "Yes," Ethan said. The third trip was the most dangerous. He had come back down for the second time and Curtis had confirmed that Mara had the shelter organized and the second chamber was opening up and the communications panel had partially activated. One of the old emergency radio frequencies was pushing a signal, broken but real, which meant that by morning there might be outside contact. Ethan had drunk water and eaten a second ration block and adjusted his thermal layers and then gone back out into the dark. It was dark now. Full dark, the storm dark that is different from regular night because the snow light that usually softens mountain darkness in winter was swallowed by the density of the weather. He was operating on his tactical light, on Ghost's directional instinct, and on the map of the slope that he had been building in his memory since morning. Curtis had told him about Wade Mercer before he left. Wade had been at the community center when the situation there hit capacity. He had been managing the overflow in his outfitter's shop with the proprietary authority of a man who owned the space and wanted everyone to know it. And then the call had come in from the Valley Road. A section of the road's upper embankment had collapsed under the storm loading, closing the western route back to town, and 2 vehicles and their occupants were now stranded in the cold on the wrong side of a debris field with no shelter and no access. One of those vehicles was Wade Mercer's truck. He had been out there, for reasons that Curtis described with the compressed irritation of someone who had not had time to fully process the irony, trying to direct traffic on the Valley Road with the unsolicited authority of a man who considered local crisis management his personal domain. The embankment had gone while he was out of his truck. He had made it back to the vehicle, but the debris field between him and town was impassable, and the temperature was still falling, and his truck heater was running but the fuel gauge was entering its final quarter. Ethan had listened to this information with a face that showed nothing. Then he had picked up his pack and gone out into the dark. The Valley Road approach was a different route than the slope work he had been doing, lower, through the treeline, then across an open section that was exposed to full wind before the terrain curved around to the embankment area. Ghost moved ahead of him through the trees with the focused silence of a train tracker working a known-type environment, and Ethan moved behind him and thought about nothing except the terrain and the cold, and the next step. He thought about Wade Mercer's voice on the Main Street sidewalk. He thought about the way it had carried, the way it had been designed to carry, the specific construction of someone who wanted an audience for a dismissal. He thought about the people who had laughed, and the people who had stayed silent, and what, in the end, the difference between those 2 groups actually amounted to. He thought about Marcus, his son. He thought about him the way he always thought about him in difficult physical situations, not with grief exactly, not in these moments, but with the particular proximity that felt like company. Marcus had loved winter. Had loved snow and cold and the mountain terrain with the uncomplicated enthusiasm of a 9-year-old for whom the natural world was still primarily an invitation. He had gone out in weather that adults found miserable with an expression of pure unreasonable delight, and Ghost had run beside him in the snow with something that looked, in a dog, very much like the same unreasonable delight. Ethan felt Ghost slow and then stop, and he stopped behind him and looked. 2 sets of headlights in the dark, 50 yards ahead, on the wrong side of a debris field that extended roughly 30 feet across the road. The debris was snow and rock and what appeared to be sections of old timber from the embankment structure, not massive, but enough to have blocked vehicle passage completely. He could see a figure standing between the 2 vehicles, and even at 50 yards and in the dark he recognized the silhouette, the thick build, the expensive winter coat, the particular posture of a man who was used to being the largest presence in any situation and was not handling the experience of helplessness well. Ghost moved toward the vehicles. Ethan followed. Wade saw the dog first. The white shape emerging from the dark with the clean, unhurrying movement of an animal that owned its environment, Ghost did not look like he was struggling through the storm. He looked like he was simply moving through it, the way the mountain moved through it, with the complete indifference of something that belongs in a place. Wade stared at Ghost for a moment, and then looked up and saw Ethan, and something moved across the man's face that was not easy to categorize. It was not relief exactly. It was not gratitude. It was something closer to the complicated internal collision of a person who has built a significant portion of their self-image on a particular story, and has just found themselves in a situation that puts a direct question to that story. "Cade," Wade said. His voice was controlled, but the control had cost him something. There was a second vehicle 20 feet behind Wade's truck. A small SUV with 2 occupants, an older woman and a man of similar age who turned out to be her brother, both of them from one of the North Valley properties, both of them cold but functional. Ethan assessed them quickly and moved to them first, which he did not plan in advance as a statement but which was, in the event, a statement. "Can you walk?" he asked the woman. "We've been walking since 1950, she said, which was not precisely an answer but conveyed the necessary information. "Good. We're going up." He turned to Wade. Wade was looking at him with the expression of a man waiting for something, for an acknowledgement of the morning, for a redistribution of power, for some conversational reckoning that would allow him to position himself on better terms. He was waiting for Ethan to say something that he could respond to in a way that preserved some portion of his standing. Ethan said, "Can you walk?" A pause. "Yes," Wade said. "Then walk." Ethan turned and moved toward the tree-line. Ghost fell in beside him. The older woman and her brother fell in behind Ghost. And after a moment, Wade Mercer began to follow. They went up the mountain in silence except for the storm. Ghost set the pace, steady, not punishing, calibrated to the slowest functional member of the group in the way that working dogs calibrate without being asked. The older woman moved with the determined competence of someone who had spent a long life in mountain terrain, and was not going to be beaten by it now. Her brother kept one hand on her elbow and kept pace. Wade moved in the middle of the group and said nothing. Ethan watched the slope. He watched the tree cover above them. He watched the ridgeline where the storm loading was heaviest, and where the Geological Survey's high-risk markers were located. He had been watching it on every trip and it had held. But the storm was not done, and the loading was still increasing, and there was a point at which held became a historical description rather than a current condition. He calculated that they had approximately 40 minutes before that point arrived. They moved faster. When they reached the entrance, and Ethan got the door open and the warmth of the underground came out to meet them, the older woman stopped in the entrance and looked into the lit chamber and looked at the children on the cots and looked at the storage cabinets and the heater and the other huddled figures who had arrived before her, and she said something quiet that Ethan didn't hear because he was watching the ridgeline. Ghost stayed at the entrance. Ethan looked at the dog. Ghost was not going in. He was sitting at the entrance with his nose pointed back up the slope, ears forward, the body posture of a dog who has not finished the job yet. Ethan stood in the entrance of the underground shelter with the warmth of the chamber at his back and the blizzard on his face, and looked at his dog. "What?" he said. Ghost looked at him. Then looked up the slope. Ethan turned and looked up the slope. He could see nothing in the dark and the storm. He could hear nothing except the wind. But Ghost's posture was unambiguous. The dog had registered something, and he was not moving until Ethan acknowledged it. "There's no one else out there," Ethan said. He said it not to argue with the dog but to test the statement against what he knew, and as he ran through the list of confirmed locations and confirmed arrivals and Curtis's count and Mara's situation board, he hit a gap. There was a gap in the list. He had been running so fast through the night that he hadn't stopped to check the full inventory. He went back inside and found Mara at the communications panel. "Who's unaccounted for?" he said. Mara looked at her list. She ran her finger down it. She stopped. "The Delacroix family," she said. "East Ridge. Grandmother and 2 grandchildren. She called in at 2 o'clock saying they were sheltering in place. I told her to stay put while we got the main shelters organized. I was going to send Curtis." She stopped. "Curtis came up here instead. I didn't send anyone back to the East Ridge." Ethan was already at the door. "The East Ridge route goes past the north face," Mara said, and her voice was careful in the way of someone who is being accurate rather than frightening, but the information is frightening regardless. "The Geological Survey." "I know," Ethan said. "Ethan." She said his name with the particular quality of someone who has something important to say and is making a decision about whether to say it. "The north face lode. It's been building all night. If it goes while you're on the East Ridge Traverse." "I know." Ghost was at his side. They went out. The East Ridge approach required climbing above the main shelter entrance, and then traversing the slope eastward across a section of terrain that ran directly below the north face's most unstable section. In daylight, in good conditions, it was a 30-minute walk. In the dark, in a full blizzard, with the north face loaded to its risk threshold above them, it was something else. Ethan moved fast. He moved with the deliberate speed of someone who has calculated the risk and made a decision and is now past the calculation and entirely inside the movement. Ghost moved beside him, matching his pace exactly, the dark shape of the tactical jacket against the white storm his only reliable fixed point in the visual chaos. They crossed the lower section of the traverse in 12 minutes, and then the route steepened and the wind came across the face with a force that required forward lean and deliberate foot placement, each step tested before committed. He heard the Delacroix house before he saw it, a window shutter that had come partially free and was banging against the exterior wall in the wind, a rhythmic percussion against the general roar of the storm. The house was a small structure tucked into the eastern tree line, low-roofed, old timber construction, one light burning in the main window from what was clearly a battery lantern because the power had been out for hours. Ghost broke into a trot for the last 50 yards, which meant he had the scent now. Ethan knocked hard. The woman who opened the door was in her 70s, compact and sharp-eyed, wearing what appeared to be her entire wardrobe in layers, with 2 children visible behind her, a boy and a girl, both young, both bundled, both awake with the wide-eyed alertness of children who have been awake for too long in a situation that adults are clearly treating as serious. "Mrs. Delacroix?" Ethan said. "That's me." She looked at him. She looked at Ghost. She looked back at him. "You're the one who was helping people." "Yes." "We've been waiting," she said, with the entirely reasonable tone of someone for whom waiting had been the correct decision. "I know. I'm sorry it took this long. We need to move now." She looked at the children. She looked back at Ethan. "How far?" 25 minutes. Maybe less. My dog is going to lead. I need you to keep moving and not stop." She turned and spoke to the children in a voice that was calm and clear and left no room for negotiation. They were going now, they were going to be fine, they were going to hold hands and follow the dog. The children looked at Ghost. Ghost held very still and looked back at them with his dark, steady eyes. The girl reached out and touched his ear. Ghost waited. "All right," the grandmother said. "Let's go." They went. Ethan got them onto the traverse and moving at a pace he had calculated against the child's stride length, and the terrain difficulty, and the remaining margin on his north face estimate. Ghost led without hesitation, picking the best line through the snow with the instinctive terrain reading of a dog who has worked mountain environments, threading between the drifts and the exposed rock sections and the places where the footing was compromised. The grandmother moved with a determination that was almost fierce. She did not slow, she did not complain, she kept one hand on her granddaughter's shoulder and kept her eyes on Ghost's dark jacket ahead. They were 2/3 of the way across the traverse when Ethan heard it. It was not a loud sound. That was what surprised people who had never been near an avalanche. The initial fracture was often quieter than expected, a deep structural crack followed by a brief silence that was somehow worse than the sound that followed it. He heard the fracture. He counted 1 second of silence. He looked up at the north face. "Move," he said. He said it with the specific volume and tone calibrated for one purpose: instant compliance. "Move now. Fast. Don't look up." The grandmother moved. The children moved. Ghost broke into a run. The sound behind them grew from a whisper to a rush to a roar in the span of about 8 seconds, and Ethan was running with his hand at the grandmother's back and the children were running and Ghost was 30 feet ahead of them and the roar was enormous and directional and getting louder, and then they cleared the traverse. They dropped below the tree line on the eastern edge. The trees took the force of the leading edge of the debris, not a full avalanche, not the catastrophic failure of the entire face, but a slab release from the upper section, significant, fast-moving, heavy with compacted snow and small rock debris, and it swept across the traverse route they had just left and continued down the open slope below in a spreading fan of white and gray. Where they had been standing 30 seconds ago. Ethan stood in the tree line with his hand still on the grandmother's shoulder and listened to the slide finish its run below them. The children were breathing hard. The grandmother was breathing hard. Ghost stood 6 feet ahead of them, facing back toward the noise, watching the slide with his ears up and his tail still. Then Ghost turned. He looked at Ethan. Then he turned toward the shelter entrance and began walking. Nobody said anything for a long time. They walked. The storm was still blowing. The mountain was still full of wind and dark and cold. But they walked, and Ghost led, and the entrance came out of the dark ahead of them as a seam of warm light around the door frame, and Ethan opened the door, and they went inside. The underground shelter was full. Not uncomfortably full, not the desperate, compressed fullness of a space that has exceeded its design capacity, but the full of a place that is functioning at its purpose. Both chambers were occupied. The children were on cots. The older residents were in the folded camp chairs that Curtis had found in the secondary storage units. The Valley family was grouped near the heater with mugs of hot water from the reserve supply. The school transport driver had organized the older children into a helper rotation, distributing ration packs and keeping track of the younger ones. Curtis was at the communications panel with Mara, working the emergency frequency with the focused patience of someone who had been trying to punch a signal through a mountain for 2 hours. Ghost moved through the full chamber in a slow circuit, checking each person the way he checked spaces, methodically, without rush, a nose touch here, a pressed head there, the particular quiet attention of a dog who understands that his job in this moment is not tracking or alerting but simply presence. People touched him as he passed. Every single person touched him. The grandmother from the East Ridge sat down in the first available chair and looked at the room and said nothing. Her grandchildren found the girl in the red hat, who had apparently established herself as the social anchor of the shelter's younger population, and within 4 minutes were part of whatever quiet game she had organized among the cots. Ethan set his pack down for the last time. He stood in the center of the chamber with the warmth of the heater against his face and the sounds of the people around him, breathing, quiet conversation, children's voices, the static end signal rhythm of the communications panel, and he felt the specific quality of exhaustion that comes after extreme sustained effort, the kind that is not unpleasant because it has a foundation under it. He had done the thing. The thing was done. Wade Mercer was in the corner of the main chamber, sitting on a cot with his elbows on his knees, not talking to anyone. He had been in the shelter for 40 minutes, and he had said very little. He had watched the room fill around him, the people he knew, the people whose names he knew, the people he had stood among on a Main Street sidewalk that morning and performed for, and he had said very little because there was, in the end, very little to say that would be adequate. Mara left the communications panel and crossed the chamber. She stopped in front of Wade. She had the folded map in her hand, the 1962 topographic map from the steel table in the second chamber, the one with the Mercer notation in the corner. She unfolded it. She set it on the cot beside him. Wade looked at the map. He did not look up. "W.T. Mercer," Mara said. "That's you?" The chamber had gone quieter. Not silent. The children's sounds continued, the communications panel continued, but the adults nearest to them had registered the shift in Mara's voice and had adjusted their attention without making it obvious. "The quarterly inspection protocol," Mara continued. "Suspended in 2003. The land use application. The expansion project." She paused. "You knew this place was here. You knew it was registered as a community emergency shelter. And you buried the paperwork because it was inconvenient for your development plans." Wade said nothing. "There are 51 people in this shelter tonight," Mara said. Her voice was still controlled, but the control had an edge to it now. 51 people who would have been in serious danger without it. Including children. She paused. "Including you?" The grandmother from the East Ridge was listening. The school transport driver was listening. The Valley family was listening. The older man from the North Ridge, who had been barely coherent with cold when Ethan brought him in, and who had recovered enough in the warmth to be fully present, was listening. Wade Mercer looked up. His face looked different than it had on Main Street. The public confidence was gone, not replaced by anything dramatic, not shame exactly, not yet, but by a kind of stripped quality, like something that had been load-bearing had been removed and the structure above it was still standing, but you could see where the support used to be. "I didn't think," he started. "No," Mara said. "You didn't." Silence. Then the grandmother from the East Ridge said, from across the room, in the clear, unadorned voice of a woman who had decided to say a thing and was not interested in softening it, "My grandchildren were in that house for 6 hours. In the dark. Waiting." Wade looked at her. "That man," she indicated Ethan, who was standing near the heater with Ghost at his feet, "came out in the dark. In that storm. On that mountain. After you put him out in the morning like he was nothing." The room held the words. Nobody added to them. Nobody needed to. Ethan looked at Wade. He looked at him the way he looked at a great many things, with the pale blue eyes that did not perform anger or judgment but simply saw, clearly and without embellishment, what was in front of them. He had no speech prepared. He had no confrontation planned. The man across the chamber was a small person who had made small choices for small reasons, and the results of those choices were written on the faces of every person in the room. That was sufficient. He turned away. He went and sat down with his back against the wall, and Ghost came and lay down against his leg, and Ethan put his hand on the dog's back between his shoulders, and Ghost breathed out slowly and his whole body settled, and Ethan closed his eyes. He did not sleep. Not yet. He let himself rest in the warmth and the sound of the people around him, and he let the exhaustion move through him like a tide, and he sat with the specific awareness that he was in a safe place, and the people around him were safe, and Ghost was warm, and the storm outside could do what it wanted. After a while, he became aware that Mara had sat down on the floor across from him, her back against the opposite wall, her knees pulled up, watching the room. She had the quiet alertness of someone still in operational mode, monitoring, assessing, staying available, but her body had found rest inside that alertness in the way that people who are good at their work sometimes can. "You came up the mountain," Ethan said. "I thought." Mara paused. "I thought there was something up here. I saw the survey notation a long time ago and I never followed up on it." She looked at the wall. "I should have." "You couldn't have known." "I knew enough to wonder," she said. "I just didn't wonder hard enough." She looked at Ghost. "He found it." "He always does," Ethan said. The communications panel made a sound, a shift in the static quality, a frequency stabilizing, and Curtis's voice came through with a clarity that he hadn't achieved in hours. "Mara, I'm getting county emergency on the channel. They have contact." Mara was on her feet before he finished the sentence. Outside, the storm was changing. Ethan could feel it in the air pressure of the chamber, a subtle equalization, the barometric shift that preceded a storm's peak. The peak was not the end. After the peak came the heaviest accumulation, the period of maximum weight and minimum visibility, and then, sometimes hours later, the turn. The loosening. The moment when the pressure system began to move on and the mountain began to breathe again. It was not over. But the worst was past. He knew this because he could read storms the way he could read terrain and the way Ghost could read scent, not by any single indicator but by the accumulated pattern of small signals that assembled themselves into a direction. He had been reading this storm for 12 hours and he had known its arc from the moment it arrived, and what he felt now in the air of the underground chamber was the beginning of the turn. He closed his eyes again. And then Ghost moved. Not urgently. Not with the sharp alertness of a working alert, just a purposeful rising, a direction change, a quiet press of his nose toward the rear of the chamber, and the corridor to the second room. Ethan opened his eyes and watched the dog stand and look at him, and then look toward the corridor. "More to find?" Ethan said. Ghost went to the corridor door and stood there. Ethan got up. His body reported this to him with the thorough and detailed accounting that comes after extreme physical effort, every muscle group submitting its grievance in sequence, and he moved through it and followed the dog into the corridor. In the second chamber, Ghost moved past the map table and past the communications installation and past the rows of folded cots and all the way to the far end of the room, where the sanitation corridor branched off. But he didn't go into the sanitation corridor. He stopped at the wall adjacent to it, the far end wall, the deepest point of the structure, the wall that was the most mountain and the least construction. He pressed his nose against the section of the wall where the concrete met the rough-cut stone of the mountain itself, and he sniffed in the long, controlled draws of a dog locating a precise source. Ethan brought his flashlight up. There was a seam in the wall. Not a crack, a seam. Deliberate. Hairline nearly invisible, but following a rectangular outline roughly 2 feet wide and 3 feet tall, set into the junction between the concrete wall and the stone behind it. A compartment. Sealed from this side with a flush-mounted locking mechanism that was visible only because he was looking at the seam with the flashlight held at an oblique angle. He worked the mechanism. It was smaller than the bar locks on the doors, a simple rotary lock, the kind used in archival and document storage. He turned it. It turned. The small door swung open on concealed hinges. Inside the compartment were 3 things. The first was a metal document case, military specification, sealed at the clasps, approximately 12 inches by 18, 2 inches deep. The second was a small bundle wrapped in oilcloth and tied with wax cord, the kind of storage you use for objects you were trying to preserve against the years. The third was a journal, a standard composition notebook, black-covered, sealed inside a heavy plastic pouch, the kind of pouch used for waterproof storage of important documents. Ethan removed the journal first. He opened the plastic pouch and took the notebook out, and opened it, and read the first page in the flashlight beam. The handwriting was precise and masculine, written in the careful capital-heavy style that had been common among a certain generation of educated men. The date on the first entry was September 14, 1961. Property of Captain James R. Hartley, USMC, retired. Notes and record of construction and commissioning of Elk Ridge Community Emergency Shelter, designated under Civil Defense Preparedness Act, Region 7, Montana. This record to remain sealed within the structure for the preservation of operational history. Ethan turned pages. He read quickly, scanning the construction notes, the engineering details, the community coordination records, who had been involved, who had contributed labor, who had agreed to the stewardship arrangements. He read the names of people who had built something real and left it for the people who came after them, sealed it with care and marked it with intention, intending that it would be found and used. He turned to the last entry. It was dated July 3, 1979. The handwriting was slightly different, the same care but less steadiness, the hand of an older man. This structure was built for one reason, so that when the mountain is against us, the people of this valley have somewhere to go. It was built with volunteer labor and civil defense funding and the goodwill of neighbors who understood that survival is not an individual act. I am old enough now that I will not be the one to use it when it is needed. I trust that someone else will find it. I trust that whoever finds it will understand what it was built for, and will do what needs to be done. If you are reading this, the mountain has tested your valley. I hope you are warm. I hope the people with you are safe. Do your duty. J.R. Hartley, Captain, USMC. Ethan read the last entry twice. He stood in the deepest room of the underground shelter with his flashlight casting its circle of light on the old notebook, and the mountain was above him, and the storm was above the mountain, and 51 people were warm and alive in the chambers behind him, and Ghost sat beside him and pressed the top of his head against Ethan's thigh with a gentle, deliberate pressure. Ethan put his hand on the dog's head. He stood there for a while. He did not cry. He had not cried since the hospital corridor, and he did not cry now, but something moved through him that was in the same country as grief and in the same country as gratitude and in the same country as the specific, clarifying recognition that arrives when a person who has been lost finds something that looks like a direction. Do your duty. He thought about Marcus. He thought about his son in the snow with Ghost running beside him, the two of them ridiculous in their combined enthusiasm, the dog and the boy both moving with the same unreasonable joy. He thought about what Marcus would have thought of this night, this particular night, this mountain, this chamber, these people. He thought that Marcus would have loved Ghost's performance with a devotion that would have been genuinely difficult to manage. He thought that Marcus would have asked approximately 900 questions about the underground structure, and its history, and Captain James Hartley, and what civil defense meant, and why they built it, and were there more like this, and could they come back in the summer and look around? He thought, I would have answered every single one. He thought, I still can. Not to Marcus. That door was closed, and it was not going to open again. But to the girl in the red hat who had grabbed Ghost's jacket handle in the dark van without hesitation. To the grandmother's grandchildren who were learning whatever children learn from nights like this. To the questions that the world kept generating even when the world had taken the specific person you most wanted to answer them. He picked up the oilcloth bundle and unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a photograph and a small brass compass. The photograph was black and white, printed on heavy stock, showing a group of men and women standing in front of what was recognizably the entrance to the underground shelter, the door frame, the mountain behind it, the particular angle of the slope. They were dressed in work clothes, most of them smiling, one man at the center who held a shovel and was looking at the camera with the expression of a person who has just finished something real and is glad of it. There was a handwritten caption on the back, Elk Ridge Shelter Commission, October 1961. We built something that will last. Ethan looked at the photograph for a long time. He looked at the faces, ordinary faces, working people, a small mountain town in 1961 building something for the people who would come after them. He looked at the man with the shovel, who he assumed was Captain Hartley, and he thought about the last journal entry and the phrase "do your duty" and what it had meant to the man who wrote it, and what it meant to the man who had found it, 64 years later, in the middle of a blizzard, after being thrown out of a town that didn't know what it had. He put the photograph and the compass in his jacket pocket. He picked up the metal document case. He would give this to Mara. Whatever was inside, the formal records, the civil defense designation, the property documentation, it belonged with someone who would know what to do with it. He already knew what she would do with it. He had been watching her work for the past few hours, and he knew exactly the kind of person she was and what she did with things that needed to be done. He carried the case and the journal back through the corridor to the main chamber. The first thing he noticed was that the communications panel was alive. Not the struggling, broken signal of earlier, a clean, established contact, county emergency frequency, a voice on the other end that Mara was talking to in the calm, precise cadence of someone who has been through a long night and is now managing the transition to morning. She was giving numbers, head count, medical status, location coordinates, access route estimates, and the voice on the other end was responding with the organized efficiency of a system that had finally made contact with the piece of itself that had been missing. The second thing he noticed was that several people were awake. The storm change had worked its way even into the sealed underground warmth, barometric, almost subliminal, the signal that the body registers before the mind catches up, and faces that had been sleeping were now open and quiet, looking at nothing, feeling the change. The third thing he noticed was Wade Mercer. Wade was sitting in the same corner he had been in when Ethan left, but he was no longer in the posture of a man waiting for a confrontation to pass. He was sitting forward, elbows on knees, and he was talking. Not to the room, to the transport driver, who had settled near him at some point in the past hour, and who was listening with the particular focused attention of someone who was hearing something worth hearing. Wade's voice was too low for Ethan to make out words from across the chamber, but the quality of it was different. The performance had come out of it. Whatever was left was something Ethan had not heard from Wade Mercer before. Mara finished her radio contact and turned and saw Ethan with the document case and the journal. Her eyes went to the case and then to the journal and then to his face, and she read something in his face that made her come toward him without asking. He gave her the document case. "For the county," he said. "It has the official records. The shelter registration. Everything they'll need." She took it. She looked at the journal. "Captain Hartley built this," Ethan said. "In '61. He was USMC, retired. He left a record inside." He handed her the journal. "The last entry is worth reading." She held the journal carefully, the way people hold things they recognize as important. "What does it say?" "Do your duty," Ethan said. She looked at him. "I think you would have considered tonight a success," Ethan said. The night moved through its final hours with the particular quality of aftermath, not celebration, not relief exactly, but the specific stillness that settles over people when the acute danger has passed and they are still together in the same space and the hours ahead are manageable even if they are not yet comfortable. The storm was past its peak. The temperature outside was still severe but no longer in the range of immediate threat to properly sheltered people. The county emergency coordinator had confirmed that a heavy equipment team would begin clearing the valley road from the eastern approach at first light, and that snowmobile access routes would be assessed as soon as visibility allowed, which was expected by mid-morning. They were in for the night. But the night was finite now. Curtis fell asleep in his chair. Several of the children had migrated to Ghost's vicinity, and arranged themselves around him with the unself-conscious practicality of young people who have identified the warmest and most comforting available surface. Ghost was awake. He was always awake, at some level, the ears moving, the dark eyes open, the quiet vigilance of a working animal who accepted rest but not absence. He submitted to the children's arrangement with the patient dignity of someone who understood that being needed was not a burden. Ethan sat with his back against the wall, and Mara sat a few feet away, and they did not talk for a long time. It was a comfortable silence, the silence of two people who have been through something together, and do not need to narrate it to each other. Then Mara said, "Where are you going to go?" "After." Ethan considered the question. He had not considered it seriously since the morning, The morning had not been the kind of morning that allowed for serious future planning, but it was, in its way, the central question. Before Elk Ridge. After this shelter. Into what? I don't know yet, he said. That's an honest answer. It's the only kind I have. Mara was quiet for a moment. Then, there are things that need doing in this valley. The shelter needs to be recertified and documented and made officially accessible again. Someone needs to deal with the county on the land use records. Someone needs to assess the north face slide damage for the spring and make sure the survey markers are current. She paused. Those are real things. They need someone who knows what they're doing and can work with difficult conditions. Ethan looked at her. I'm not offering you a job, she said. I'm saying the work exists. And you're saying it to me specifically. You're the one who found the shelter, she said. Seems like you have a stake in what happens to it. Ghost raised his head from the children and looked at Ethan. Ethan looked at the dog. We'll see, he said. Mara nodded. She did not press. She sat with the document case in her lap and the journal beside her, and the situation bored in her mind and the coming morning in front of her, and she let the silence be the silence that it was. Sometime in the deep of that night, while most of the shelter's occupants slept, the girl in the red hat appeared beside Ethan. She had been awake. He had seen her awake intermittently throughout the night, the particular unable to sleep wakefulness of a child who has been through something exciting and frightening and is still processing. She stood beside him for a moment, and then sat down cross-legged on the concrete floor with the unceremonious ease of a child who has decided where she wants to be and has gone there. Ghost shifted toward her immediately, and put his chin on her knee. She stroked his ear. Is he your dog or are you his person? She asked. She had the solemn directness of children who have not yet learned to front-load their questions with social padding. Ethan thought about it. Both, he said. Neither. It's a partnership. She considered this with appropriate seriousness. My dad says dogs pick their people. That's true sometimes. Did Ghost pick you? He was assigned to me first, Ethan said. In the military. But then the assignment ended and he stayed anyway. So. He paused. I think that counts as picking. Yeah, she said. That definitely counts. She sat with Ghost's chin on her knee and stroked his ear in the slow, steady rhythm that dogs like, and Ethan watched her and thought about Marcus with the same rhythm and the same dog and the same quality of unconditional attention, and the grief was there. It was always there, but it was sitting differently than it usually sat. Less like a weight and more like a presence. Something that had come to live with him rather than something that was trying to end him. He thought about Captain Hartley. He thought about the photograph, the working people in front of the door, building something real. He thought about what it meant to build something for people who hadn't arrived yet, for a need that hadn't happened yet, for a future that was abstract until it wasn't. He thought Marcus would have said the shelter was the coolest thing he had ever seen. He thought he would have been right. The girl in the red hat fell asleep against Ghost's side somewhere around 4 a.m, in the gradual way of children who resist sleep and then surrender to it completely. Ghost made a small adjustment of his weight to make her more comfortable without waking her. Ethan watched the dog take care of the child, and the mountain held its warmth over all of them, and outside the storm turned and began to move away. Dawn came to Elk Ridge late in December, slowly, the light arriving not as a sudden event but as a gradual lightening of the eastern sky that filtered through the storm's trailing edge in shades of pale gold and gray. The wind had dropped to a steady cold push instead of the battering force of the previous night. The snow had stopped. The valley below the mountain was buried under 26 inches of new accumulation, smooth and unbroken in the early light, every surface rounded and white and quiet. At the shelter entrance, Ethan pushed the door open and stepped outside for the first time since the East Ridge run. The cold hit him, but it was different cold now, the cold of a world that had finished something, the still cold that follows extreme weather, clear and sharp and honest. He could see the valley from the slope's vantage point, the town below with its smoke rising from chimneys and generators, the mountain above him with the scar of the north face slide visible as a gray streak across the white. He could see the road being worked by a machine far below, a small orange shape pushing through the white, a plow moving east from town, the outside world beginning to reach back in. Ghost came out beside him. The dog stood on the snowy slope in the pale December light and looked at the valley with the calm attention he brought to all environments, present, aware, either troubled by what had happened nor indifferent to it. His white coat in the morning light was almost luminous, the black tactical jacket a sharp contrast. He looked like what he was, a working animal at rest between assignments, conserving himself, watching the world with steady professional interest. People began to emerge behind them. First Curtis, blinking and pulling on his jacket. Then the transport driver. Then the Valley family and the grandmother's brother, and the older man from the North Ridge who had been confused with cold the night before and who was now entirely himself, looking at the mountain morning with the specific expression of a man who has had an honest encounter with his own mortality and found himself still on the right side of it. The children came out in a group, the girl in the red hat at the front, and they stood in the cold morning and looked at the buried mountain slope and at the sky clearing in the east and at the vast white valley below, and said nothing because the view did not need commentary. The grandmother from the East Ridge came out and stood in the entrance, and looked at the morning and then looked at Ethan. "Well?" she said. That was all. Wade Mercer came out last. He stood in the entrance of the shelter he had buried, the shelter his family had been trusted to keep and had instead made disappear, and he looked at the morning and at the people who stood in it, and he did not say anything for a long time. Then he said, to no one specifically, "I need to talk to the county." Nobody responded immediately. Then Mara said, "Yes. You do." She had the document case under her arm. She had the journal in her hand. She stood in the December light on the Montana mountainside with her auburn hair coming out from under her wool beanie in the wind, and she looked at Wade Mercer with the specific expression of someone who has already decided what the next steps are and is waiting for everyone else to get there. The transport driver had gotten a signal on his phone, the first signal since the van had gone off the road the previous afternoon, and the morning began to organize itself into the specific activity of aftermath, calls being made, confirmations exchanged, the machinery of the outside world re-engaging with a small mountain town that had spent a night alone with itself and its own emergency. Ethan stood a little apart from it. He stood on the slope in the pale winter light with Ghost beside him, and he watched the people he had spent the night keeping alive begin to move back toward their lives, and he felt the particular quality of this moment, not triumph, not vindication, not the satisfaction of having been proven right against people who had been wrong about him. Those were small things compared to what was actually here. What was here was simpler than any of those things. What was here was a morning that had not been certain the night before. A girl in a red hat running across the snow towards something her friends had found. An old woman looking at the valley with the expression of someone who has settled an account with the mountains and is content with the terms. Children whose names he had learned in the dark tunnels of the shelter laughing at something in the clear morning air, the laughter rising white in the cold. He thought about Captain Hartley writing in his journal, "I trust that someone else will find it." He had found it. Ghost had found it. And the finding had done what the building had intended. He thought about the photograph in his jacket pocket, the working people in front of the door, the man with the shovel, the caption on the back. "We built something that will last." He thought about what it meant to leave something behind that was useful. What it meant to build for need you would not be present to see. What it meant to trust the future was something real. He put his hand on Ghost's back. The dog was warm under his palm, the white fur catching the morning light, breathing steadily in the cold air with the easy depth of an animal at rest. "Good work," Ethan said. Ghost leaned slightly into his hand. Mara came to stand beside him. She